A prejudiced police officer abruptly pulled over a black judge, suspecting his car was stolen. However, when his true identity was revealed, it not only ended her career, but also shed light on the harsh reality of racial discrimination within the justice system. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more eye-opening stories that you won't want to miss. Malcolm Bennett, a distinguished black judge, was making his way home after a grueling day in court. He lived in Crestwood Park, a quiet, well-kept neighborhood known for its peaceful streets and strong sense of community. It was his sanctuary, the place where he could leave behind the weight of high-stakes legal battles and unwind in solitude. Malcolm was no stranger to adversity. Growing up in a rough inner-city neighborhood, he had seen the ugly side of injustice firsthand. The struggles he faced only fueled his determination to rise above them. From a young boy fighting for the right to an education, he had defied all odds, carving a path to the judge's bench. A beacon of hope for those who, like him, had once been overlooked by society. His recently purchased Audi, a reward for his years of dedication, glided effortlessly over the smooth streets of Crestwood Park. The golden hues of the setting sun painted the neighborhood in a warm, inviting glow, enhancing its charm. Inside the car, the soft melodies of jazz flowed from the radio, blending perfectly with the crisp evening air. Malcolm exhaled slowly, embracing this rare moment of peace, a time to reflect on his work and momentarily set aside the burdens of his profession. This was his favorite part of the day, a slow, reflective drive through familiar streets, a fleeting escape from the injustices he spent his days confronting. But the tranquility was short-lived. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror, the sharp wail of a siren slicing through the stillness. Malcolm's brows furrowed in confusion. Had he unknowingly committed a traffic violation? He was certain he wasn't speeding, and his registration was up to date. Regardless, he remained calm, signaling and carefully pulling over to the side of the road. A police cruiser rolled to a stop behind him. A tall officer with a rigid stance stepped out, her uniform crisp, her expression unreadable. The name on her badge read, Officer Rachel Dawson. With a deliberate stride and sharp gaze, Dawson approached the driver's side window. Malcolm lowered his window, keeping both hands on the steering wheel, an instinct ingrained by years of knowing how situations like this could go wrong. License and registration, Dawson ordered, her voice clipped and devoid of courtesy. Malcolm, slightly taken aback by her abrasive tone, nodded and reached toward the glove compartment, moving slowly and deliberately. Retrieving his documents, he handed them over, his voice composed and even. Officer, my name is Judge Malcolm Bennett. I live in this neighborhood, and this is my vehicle. May I ask why I've been stopped? Dawson glanced at the documents, her face betraying no emotion. She barely acknowledged his words before taking a step back. Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Bennett, she ordered, her tone cold and unwavering. Malcolm blinked, caught off guard. Officer, I don't understand. What exactly have I done wrong? He kept his voice steady, though tension crept into his chest. Step out of the vehicle, Dawson repeated, her voice now edged with impatience. Her hand hovered near the holster at her hip, a subtle but unmistakable warning. A familiar, heavy feeling settled over Malcolm. He had heard too many stories like this, and he knew how quickly things could escalate. He studied Dawson's face, searching for any sign of reason, any recognition of who he was. There was none. She either didn't care or had already made up her mind. Taking a slow breath, Malcolm steadied himself. He had spent years upholding the law, but in this moment he wasn't being judged by his accomplishments, only by the color of his skin. All right, he said finally, his voice firm but controlled. Carefully, he reached for the door handle, preparing to step out, knowing that whatever happened next could change everything. Malcolm Bennett moved carefully as he opened the car door, ensuring every movement was slow and deliberate. He knew all too well how misunderstandings in situations like these could turn deadly. As he stepped out, the flashing red and blue lights from the police cruiser painted eerie streaks across his face and the pavement beneath him. Officer Rachel Dawson's gaze never wavered. It wasn't the look of someone conducting a legitimate investigation. It was something deeper, something more insidious. It was the gaze of prejudice, the eyes of someone who had already made up her mind. that he didn't belong here. A cold unease crept into Malcolm's stomach, but he pushed it down. He was a judge, he knew the law. Yet standing here in front of Dawson, that knowledge felt powerless. He wasn't being judged by his credentials, by his work, or by his character. He was being judged for something beyond his control, the color of his skin. The air grew heavier, thick, with unspoken accusations. Malcolm stood motionless beside his Audi, the alternating red and blue lights flickering across his face. His sharp eyes tracked Dawson's every move as she spoke into her radio, her voice cold and emotionless. Moments later, the distant roar of an engine broke through the stifling silence. Another patrol car pulled up, its headlights cutting harsh beams across the quiet street. The driver's door opened and a tall, rigid officer stepped out. His nameplate read, Officer Eric Lawson. His stance was firm, his expression unreadable, as if already braced for confrontation. Dawson strode toward him, speaking in hushed tones. Malcolm couldn't hear their exact words, but he saw the way Lawson's gaze immediately snapped toward him, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. It wasn't the look of an officer seeking the truth. It was the look of someone already convinced of his guilt. Dawson raised her voice, clearly speaking for Malcolm's benefit. This vehicle matches the description of a stolen Audi reported last week. A wave of anger surged through Malcolm, but he forced himself to stay composed. He clenched his jaw, fingers tightening at his sides. "This is my car," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I bought it just a few days ago. The paperwork and plates are all legal. You can check the system right now." Dawson didn't acknowledge his words. Instead, she exchanged a glance with Lawson, who gave a subtle nod. "Search the vehicle," Dawson ordered. Malcolm's chest tightened. His dignity, his years of work, his reputation, none of it mattered in this moment. He wasn't just being treated like a suspect, he was being treated like a criminal. His voice dropped lower, controlled but unmistakably sharp. "I've already told you. You don't need to search my car. Just check the system. Everything will be cleared up immediately." Dawson turned back toward him, her lips curling slightly. "This is for safety, Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled condescension. She didn't see a respected judge in front of her. She saw a black man in a car that, in her mind, was too nice for him to own. Lawson moved without hesitation, stepping toward the Audi and beginning his search. Malcolm stood his ground, watching every move, his stomach churning with frustration. From nearby houses, the glow of phone screens flickered behind curtains. Neighbors were watching, recording. Some peered out cautiously, while others held their phones high, capturing every second. What should have been a private humiliation was now becoming a public spectacle. Lawson moved to the trunk, pausing as something caught his eye. A small black bag sitting conspicuously against the otherwise spotless interior. Malcolm's brow furrowed. Lawson lifted it carefully, turning toward Dawson. "What's this?" he asked, suspicion lacing his tone. Malcolm stiffened, his pulse quickened. He had never seen that bag before. "I don't know," he replied, his voice steady despite the shock creeping in. "That bag is not mine." Dawson's lips curled into a smirk, her eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Not yours?" she echoed, drawing out the words. She didn't believe him. She never had. "We'll see what's inside." Lawson placed the bag on the hood of the car and slowly unzipped it. The air grew suffocating. Malcolm could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he watched. Inside the bag were several small sealed packets, along with a few scattered papers and a store receipt, dated that very day. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a stop anymore. It was something much, much worse. Malcolm Bennett stood frozen, his entire body rigid with disbelief. His mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. "I don't understand," he said, his voice tight, shaken by a mix of anger and fear. "This bag isn't mine. It's been planted. Someone is trying to frame me." Officer Rachel Dawson folded her arms, her expression unwavering, her eyes gleaming with quiet skepticism. "A suspicious bag in your trunk?" she mused, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "And you want us to believe it just magically appeared?" She let the words hang in the air. "Quite the story, Mr. Bennett." Malcolm inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay composed, though every fiber of his being burned with frustration. "You're accusing me without a shred of evidence," he said, his voice now level but sharp. "Do you really think this will end here? A judge, handcuffed like a criminal, right outside his home? Do you understand where this is going to lead? For the first time that night, Dawson hesitated. The certainty in her stance wavered, just for a second, but she quickly masked it, straightening her shoulders. "We're just doing our job," she said, though the conviction in her voice had faded. Malcolm knew she was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. But this wasn't just about the bag, the stop, or even his personal humiliation. This was about something far bigger. This was about every black man who had been unfairly accused, about a system that operated not on facts, but on assumptions and bias. Dawson could continue this charade if she wanted, but Malcolm wouldn't go down quietly. "You can keep pushing this, Dawson," he said, his voice cold as steel, his eyes cutting into her like a blade. "But I promise you, this won't end here." The tension had reached its peak. Dawson remained still, but Malcolm saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She glanced toward the growing crowd of neighbors, watching from their porches and windows. Some held up their phones, recording. Every second of this was being captured. Officer Eric Lawson stood by the car, his hand still resting on the black bag. Even he hadn't spoken. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. Malcolm didn't break eye contact. He was prepared for this battle, because he knew that at this moment it wasn't just his own story at stake. Then, Dawson gave a small nod. "Cuff him," she ordered, her voice sharp as a blade. Malcolm's stomach dropped. "What? No," he said, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "You can't do this." His pulse pounded in his ears. "I am Judge Malcolm Bennett, and I'm telling you, that bag is not mine." His voice rose with authority. "Before you make this mistake, verify the facts. I demand it." Dawson didn't answer. She simply turned to Lawson, her expression expectant. Lawson hesitated. For the first time, doubt crossed his face, but it wasn't enough. The glint of metal caught Malcolm's eye as Lawson stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. "You have the right to remain silent," Dawson said flatly, emotionless, as if she had recited these words 1,000 times before. Malcolm had heard them too, but never like this. Never directed at him. For the first time in his life, he felt the bitter sting of being wrongfully accused. "This is a terrible mistake," Malcolm protested, his voice shifting from measured to furious, his hands balled into fists. "Call your superior. Right now," he demanded. "I want a reasonable explanation for this." But Dawson barely looked at him. She didn't care. "Just stay quiet and cooperate," she said, her voice laced with mockery. The cold metal snapped around his wrists. Malcolm felt the world tilt, the air grow suffocating. Red and blue light swirled around him, illuminating a scene of pure injustice. He wasn't afraid, but the humiliation burned. From surrounding windows, shadowy figures watched, their silhouettes backlit by the glow of their phone screens. The quiet murmurs of neighbors filled the air, shock, anger, disbelief. Malcolm knew what they were seeing. Not Judge Malcolm Bennett, a respected figure in the legal system, just another black man in handcuffs. Lawson glanced at him briefly. There was something in his expression, a flicker of regret. He knew this was wrong, but Dawson's authority, her determination to prove herself right, had backed him into a corner. Malcolm turned his fiery gaze toward her, anger radiating from him like heat. "Do you even realize what you're doing?" he asked, his voice now blazing. "You're not just destroying my reputation, you're destroying your own. And I promise you, Dawson, you will be held accountable for this." She said nothing, but the way her jaw clenched told him that, for the first time, she was starting to feel the weight of what she had just done. For the first time that night, Officer Rachel Dawson hesitated. But it lasted only a moment before she masked it with a cold smirk. "This isn't personal, Mr. Bennett," she said flatly. "We're just doing our job." Malcolm let out a sharp, humorless laugh. The sound cut through the night air like a blade. "Your job?" he echoed, shaking his head. "You call this your job? A bag mysteriously appears in my car, a car you didn't even bother to verify belongs to me, and you expect me to believe this is about procedure and not prejudice?" Dawson didn't answer, but for the first time her eyes flickered with something. Uncertainty. Her silence was louder than words. Nearby, Officer Eric Lawson stood rigidly, his gaze shifting between Malcolm and Dawson. He could see it too, the moment when right and wrong became blurred. "Dawson," he said quietly, almost cautiously, "maybe we should double-check before we take this any further." No, she snapped too quickly. Her voice was sharp but carried less certainty than before. We're doing the right thing. Malcolm turned his piercing gaze toward Lawson, his expression heavy with meaning. You know this is wrong, he said, his voice firm but measured. Don't let yourself get dragged into her mistake. Run my plates, check my identity, you'll see the truth immediately. Lawson turned away slightly, his jaw tightening. The hesitation in his eyes was evident, but he remained silent. Dawson, though visibly shaken, forced herself to maintain control. She had to. She had come too far. As Malcolm was led toward the patrol car, the flashing police lights reflected off his face, casting an ominous glow over the moment. He exhaled slowly, realizing that this battle was no longer just about himself. It was about something much larger. This wasn't just about an unjust arrest. This was a symbol of a reality he had spent his career trying to fight. Injustice doesn't wait for the truth. It thrives on power, prejudice, and fear. But Malcolm Bennett didn't fear. He knew this was only the beginning of a fight he could not and would not lose. Dawson leaned lightly against the police car, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Malcolm, while Lawson ran additional checks through the system. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She discreetly wiped her brow, a small gesture, but one that betrayed the tension gripping her. Outwardly, she maintained the air of cold determination. Inside, a storm was brewing. She could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on her, not just watching, but judging. They knew what this was. It wasn't law enforcement at work. It was something else entirely. A memory flickered through Dawson's mind, unbidden and unwanted. 3 years ago, a dark night, a man in a luxury car, the flash of a weapon, the sharp bite of fear. She swallowed hard, pushing the memory back. That was different. That was then. This was now. But as she looked at Malcolm Bennett, the memory blurred with reality. For the first time, an unsettling thought crept in. What if she was wrong? What if her fear and past had clouded her judgment? And if she was wrong, if her instincts weren't as sharp as she believed, then she wasn't just hurting Malcolm Bennett. She was undermining everything she claimed to stand for. Lawson glanced at Dawson, his expression tinged with something that almost resembled pity. Dawson, he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. Are you okay? She turned to him sharply, but for a brief second her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. I don't know, Lawson, she admitted, the words barely audible. A breath, a hesitation. I'm not sure I even know what's right or wrong anymore. Lawson studied her carefully. Then, after a long pause, he asked the one question that had been hanging in the air all night. What do you think about him? Lawson still held the black bag in his hands. His grip tightened around it, his skepticism evident. Dawson straightened. It doesn't matter what I think, she said, her voice colder now, a shield against her own uncertainty. I have a job to do. This car matches a stolen vehicle report, and we need to clear this up. Lawson sighed, glancing toward Malcolm, who stood silently, his hands still cuffed. I don't know, Dawson, he muttered. He doesn't look like the kind of person we're after. Dawson turned to him, lowering her voice as if trying to keep the conversation between them. Listen, she said urgently, I can't afford any more mistakes. Lawson's expression hardened. A pause. He knew exactly what she meant. After last month's incident, Dawson hesitated, her gaze flickering downward. Lawson already knew. She had been reprimanded. The botched car chase, the serious consequences that had nearly ended her career. She had been walking a tightrope ever since. And now? Now she was desperate to prove herself. Lawson remained silent, his thoughts unreadable. Dawson exhaled sharply, her resolve returning. The higher-ups want results, she murmured, and I can't risk my career this time. Lawson didn't respond. But as he looked between Malcolm Bennett, a man standing tall despite the injustice before him, and Rachel Dawson, a woman standing on the edge of a decision that could change everything, he realized the weight of this moment. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which side he was on. Officer Eric Lawson sighed, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced between Malcolm Bennett and Rachel Dawson. He says he's a judge, Lawson said, keeping his tone neutral. Don't you think that's at least worth verifying? Dawson let out a dry laugh, her lips curling slightly. Anyone can claim to be a judge, she scoffed. Or a doctor, or whoever else they think will get them out of trouble. She shook her head. That doesn't prove anything to me. Then her voice dropped lower, colder. To me, he's just a black man driving an Audi. Lawson stiffened. Dawson's tone was firm, but he could hear it, something else beneath it, something that wasn't just about duty. He hesitated before speaking again, choosing his words carefully. Is there something else going on here? He asked softly, watching her closely. Dawson's expression flickered, just for a moment. Then she exhaled, her eyes darkening with something heavier than the present moment. 3 years ago, she murmured, I was robbed. She hesitated, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. The guy drove a fancy car, just like... She swallowed hard. Just like his. Lawson remained silent. I was threatened, she continued, her voice quieter now, unsteady. And since then, I can't look at people like that without... She cut herself off, forcing herself to stand straighter, without expecting the worst. A long pause settled between them. Finally, Lawson let out a slow, measured breath. I get it, Dawson, he said, his voice softer now. But we can't let personal bias dictate how we do our jobs. Dawson folded her arms across her chest, as if shielding herself from an unseen blow. I'm not prejudiced, Lawson, she said defensively. I'm just following protocol. But even as she spoke, she could feel the doubt creeping in. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone was making excuses. And this time, the person making them was her. Lawson studied her in silence for a long moment. He understood. She wasn't just dealing with a potential suspect. She was grappling with her own fears, her past, her need to prove herself. And yet, as Lawson turned his gaze toward Malcolm, standing a few feet away, hands cuffed, his face an unreadable mask of composure, he couldn't ignore the truth. Could anything she had been through justify this? Could any past trauma excuse ruining the life of an innocent man? Lawson wasn't sure, and the thought left him deeply uncomfortable. A few meters away, Malcolm remained silent, his hands bound, his expression calm but unyielding. He had listened to every word they exchanged, and while they debated their own conflicts, their own emotions, he was standing there, living the consequences of their decisions. The flashing police lights cast shifting shadows across his face, illuminating the quiet storm brewing behind his eyes. Rachel Dawson stood before him, trying to maintain her mask of authority, but Malcolm saw what was underneath. Doubt, fear, guilt. Dawson forced herself to keep her expression hard. She needed control. She needed to prove she wasn't wrong. Officer Dawson, Malcolm finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, each syllable resonating like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. You are making a grave mistake. Dawson flinched, though she tried to hide it. All it takes, Malcolm continued, is a simple check of my vehicle's registration. He stepped forward slightly, his gaze piercing. If you don't believe me, call your superior. That is the correct and lawful course of action. Dawson folded her arms tighter. I know what I'm doing, Mr. Bennett, she shot back, her tone sharp but lacking confidence. If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to worry about. Malcolm arched an eyebrow, a flicker of restrained anger crossing his features before he controlled it. Worry? He repeated, his voice low, deliberate. He took another step forward, each word slow and cutting through the air between them. No, Officer Dawson, you are the one who should be worried. Dawson's breath hitched. You're not just humiliating an innocent man. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You're destroying your reputation, your career. A flicker of hesitation, and Malcolm caught it. Do you understand that? Dawson tilted her head to the side, forcing herself to hold her ground. I'm following procedure, she snapped. If you don't like it, take it to court. A smirk ghosted across Malcolm's face, though his eyes remained sharp as a blade. Oh, don't worry, he said, leaning forward slightly. I will. Dawson's fingers curled slightly, her arms pressing tighter against her chest. Do you even see what's happening right now? Malcolm asked, his voice razor-sharp. A judge, in handcuffs, in his own neighborhood. Dawson swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. The very community he has spent his life serving. His voice dropped lower, and for the first time, Dawson felt cornered. You really think this ends here? Malcolm's eyes burned with warning. The media will descend. Lawyers will swarm. And you will pay the price. The weight of his words hung in the cold night air. A flicker of fear crossed Dawson's eyes, though she fought to suppress it. Her gaze darted to the growing crowd of neighbors, their faces a mix of concern and outrage. She knew what they saw. She knew what was being recorded. And suddenly, the reality of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave. For the first time that night, she felt completely trapped. Rachel Dawson's pulse quickened as she scanned the neighborhood. The red glow of recording lights flickered through the dim evening, cameras capturing every second of this escalating nightmare. Sweat beaded along her forehead, despite the cold. She could feel the weight of their stares, judging, questioning, condemning. Every choice she made tonight would have consequences. Officer Eric Lawson, standing nearby, recognized how dangerously out of control the situation had become. He stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Dawson, we can't stand here like this forever. He's asking for a simple check. If he really is a judge, this will turn into a media firestorm." His eyes locked onto hers, urging her to take the right path. "We need to handle this the right way." Dawson turned to him sharply, her frustration flashing through her tense posture. "I know what I'm doing, Lawson," she snapped, her voice tight with barely restrained emotion. But even as the words left her lips, she heard the tremor in her own voice, a crack in the armor. "I'm not acting out of prejudice," she added quickly, though the words felt more like an argument with herself than a statement to him. A voice cut through the heavy silence. Malcolm Bennett's. He hadn't moved. His eyes, sharp as knives, locked onto hers. "If you're not acting out of prejudice," he said smoothly, "then why not check? Just one call." A beat of silence. Then his voice dipped lower, each word precise and unwavering. "Or are you afraid of what might come to light?" Dawson clenched her fists, feeling the air around her grow suffocating. The murmurs in the distance grew louder. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk. Faces were emerging from houses, a mix of curiosity and rising indignation. Dawson turned back to Lawson, as if seeking some unspoken affirmation. But he remained silent, his expression clear. This was a moment she needed to think carefully about. Then Malcolm spoke again, his voice like steel. "Do you have any idea the brink you're standing on?" Dawson's breath hitched. "One wrong decision, and your career, your reputation," his voice was almost a whisper now, razor sharp, could crumble. The words hit her harder than she wanted to admit, but then came the second blow. "You still have a chance to make this right." The moment hung between them like a held breath. Dawson stood frozen. For the first time that night, she wasn't just reacting, she was processing. She could feel every eye on her. Every second that passed tightened the noose around her pride, her fear, her sense of duty clashing violently against the truth. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, she reached for her radio. Her voice, though heavy with resignation, was clear. "Dispatch. Call Captain Gaines to the scene." She lowered the radio, her hands trembling slightly. She had just conceded. And yet, even as she did the right thing, she realized this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Malcolm stood still, unmoved. His eyes never left Dawson, silently reminding her that the consequences of this night weren't going anywhere. The tension stretched tight like a string, ready to snap. Dawson, lowering her radio, felt her entire body trembling. She had called for backup. But she knew, deep down, what unfolded here wouldn't end with Captain Gaines arriving. It wouldn't end when the crowd dispersed. It wouldn't end when the sun rose tomorrow. The damage was already done. And whether or not she liked it, the world would remember this night. As she wrestled with the weight of what she had set in motion, a sudden sound cut through the tense silence. A window slamming open. A firm, clear voice followed. "Malcolm? What's going on here?" The voice belonged to Evelyn Porter, a longtime neighbor and one of the most outspoken voices in Crestwood Park. She wasn't just any resident, she was respected, feared by some, and never afraid to call out injustice. She stepped onto the sidewalk, her silver-streaked hair catching the glow of the streetlights. Her sharp gaze swept over the scene, immediately locking onto Malcolm, standing there, hands cuffed beside his Audi. A judge, a man she had known for years, bound like a common criminal. The fury in her eyes ignited instantly. "This isn't right," Evelyn declared, her voice loud enough to be heard by everyone. Her gaze zeroed in on Dawson, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "He's a judge, an honorable man." Her voice rose. "I've lived here long enough to know he's done nothing wrong." Her eyes darkened. "What exactly do you think you're doing to him?" Dawson straightened, trying to regain control. "Ma'am, please return to your home," she said stiffly. "This is a police investigation. It does not concern you." Evelyn Porter stood her ground. She turned, not just to Dawson, but to the neighbors watching from windows and doorsteps. "We can't just stand by and let this happen," she called out, her voice rallying the growing onlookers. "If we stay silent now, who will speak up when it happens to one of us?" The murmurs of agreement spread like wildfire. The crowd began to grow. A young man stepped out from the growing crowd, phone in hand, its screen glowing as it streamed live to countless viewers. "Evelyn, everyone's watching," he said firmly. His name was Jordan, and he wasn't just recording. He was broadcasting. "And they want to know why a judge is being treated like this." Evelyn Porter turned, scanning the gathered residents. The numbers had grown. More people had stepped out of their homes, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and anger. She lifted her chin. "We're not leaving," she announced, her voice clear and unwavering, "until you let him go. Or until you explain yourselves, right here, in front of all of us." A ripple of agreement swept through the crowd. Rachel Dawson's eyes darted nervously between them, her confidence slowly unraveling. The situation had spiraled beyond her control. The pressure from the community was suffocating. Officer Eric Lawson took a step closer, his voice low and firm. "Dawson, we need to stop this," he urged. "This is no longer just about us." The murmurs of the crowd swelled, voices overlapping, questioning, demanding answers. Evelyn Porter wasn't deterred by Dawson's authority. She stepped closer to Malcolm, standing as if to physically shield him. "This doesn't concern me," she repeated, her eyes flashing. "He's my neighbor. I know him better than anyone here." She pointed at Malcolm's Audi, still surrounded by patrol cars. "You have no right to treat him this way without a valid reason. If you don't verify his information right now, I'll call a lawyer." Dawson narrowed her eyes, frustration clear in her expression. "Ma'am," she said through gritted teeth, "I'll say this again. This is a police matter, and I'm asking you not to interfere." Evelyn Porter didn't back down. "Interfere?" she repeated, stepping forward. "If you were doing your job properly, no one would need to interfere." Dawson's breath caught. Evelyn's voice carried through the crowd like a rallying cry. "Have you even checked the car's registration?" she demanded. "Or is this just another cheap display of prejudice in our neighborhood?" A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dawson felt the weight of every single stare, recording, watching, judging. Lawson leaned in, his tone calmer but more urgent now. "We're drawing too much attention," he said. "I think we should call Captain Gaines sooner rather than later." Dawson clenched her jaw. Her confidence had already been shaken, but she was still desperate to hold her ground. "They can record all they want," she muttered, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. "I'm just doing my job." Evelyn stared directly at her. "No," she said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the air like a blade. "Your job is humiliating an innocent man in front of his community." A hush fell over the crowd. Evelyn's gaze bore into Dawson. "If you don't release him and apologize immediately, I promise you, everyone here will know exactly how you handled this." Malcolm turned to Evelyn, his voice calm but full of gratitude. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said. "I appreciate your support, but please stay safe. I will handle this." Evelyn nodded slightly, but the fire in her eyes didn't dim. She turned back to Dawson and Lawson. "Just know, Malcolm," she said, her voice carrying through the silence, "you are not alone." Dawson felt the ground shifting beneath her. The tension was crushing. The weight of the moment, the flashing cameras, the growing crowd, the unwavering strength in Malcolm's voice. It was all too much. Her every movement, her every word was being scrutinized, and she understood with terrifying clarity that whatever happened next would define her. Lawson turned to her, his disapproval clear. "We need to handle this professionally," he said, no longer just advising her, but warning her. "This isn't something we want to see on the news." Dawson didn't move. She felt the sweat on her brow, the unrelenting stares, the judgment pressing down on her like a weight she could no longer carry. And then, the distant roar of an approaching engine. The tension fractured. A patrol car pulled up, its flashing lights sending eerie shadows across the buildings. The crowd turned. The door opened. From the driver's seat emerged a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisply pressed uniform, Captain Robert Gaines. Even before he spoke, his mere presence commanded attention. But as his gaze swept over the scene, his expression changed. Because standing in handcuffs, Surrounded by officers, by police lights, by a neighborhood demanding answers, was Judge Malcolm Bennett. Captain Gaines's face shifted. From authority to shock, he strode forward, his voice booming through the thick air. "Bennett?" Malcolm lifted his chin. The crowd fell silent. The moment had finally reached its breaking point. The moment snapped everyone into sharp focus. Captain Robert Gaines stood tall, his piercing gaze sweeping over the tense scene before landing on Rachel Dawson. His eyes, brimming with disapproval, locked onto her like a judge delivering a verdict. "What is going on here?" Dawson flinched slightly, but quickly steeled herself, forcing her voice to remain even. "Captain," she began, but the nervous tremor in her tone betrayed her. "This Audi matches the description of a stolen vehicle reported last week. During our search, we found a suspicious bag in the trunk. I believed an arrest was justified as part of the investigation." Captain Gaines frowned. His sharp eyes flickered with something between confusion and disappointment. Then he turned to Malcolm Bennett, truly seeing him for the first time. His face shifted. Recognition. Realization. Dawson saw it, too late. "Dawson." Gaines' voice was suddenly hard, his authority pressing down like a weight. "Do you even know who this man is?" Silence. Dawson stood rigid, her confidence crumbling. Gaines exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. "This isn't just any citizen. This is Judge Malcolm Bennett, one of the most respected men in this city." His next words were like a hammer striking the air. "Did you verify his identity before taking action?" Dawson hesitated, and that was all the answer Gaines needed. "I didn't know, Captain," she stammered, her voice growing quieter as the weight of her failure settled over her. She had been so certain, so sure of herself, but she hadn't checked, and now the consequences were unfolding in real time. Gaines didn't wait for further excuses. His voice cut through the thick air like a blade. "Remove the cuffs, now." Officer Lawson stepped forward, unlocking Malcolm's restraints without hesitation. As the metal snapped open, Malcolm slowly brought his hands forward, rubbing the raw red marks on his wrists. Though freed, he remained motionless. His piercing gaze never left Gaines. The restrained anger simmering beneath his calm exterior was like a dormant volcano, ready to erupt. Then finally he spoke. His voice was measured, deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of the moment. "Captain Gaines," Malcolm said slowly, "what do you call this? A minor misunderstanding?" Gaines took a deep breath, visibly trying to maintain his composure. "Judge Bennett," he said carefully, "I sincerely apologize. This was a grave mistake. We will address this immediately." Malcolm's lips parted slightly. Then he let out a bitter, humorless laugh. The sound was sharp, cold, filled with derision and frustration. "A mistake?" he repeated, his tone razor-sharp. He stepped forward. "And whose mistake was it exactly?" His words hung heavy in the air, pressing Gaines back into an uncomfortable silence. "Dawson's? For acting recklessly?" His eyes flickered toward Dawson, who stood frozen, pale, her face unreadable. "Or is the real mistake the system you oversee?" Malcolm's voice darkened. "A system that allows bias to guide behavior instead of justice." A murmur spread through the gathered crowd. The weight of truth was settling in, undeniable, unshakable. Gaines' shoulders sagged slightly, the burden of the moment pressing down on him. Because Malcolm Bennett wasn't wrong, and Gaines knew it. Yet, he still felt compelled to protect his officers, even in the face of their clear wrongdoing. "Mr. Bennett," Gaines began, his tone measured but firm, "I assure you I will personally handle this matter. What happened tonight does not represent the entire force." Malcolm's sharp gaze burned into him. Then, another bitter laugh. The sound wasn't just anger. It was exhaustion, a deep, familiar weariness. "Doesn't represent?" Malcolm echoed, shaking his head. "Captain, this isn't an isolated incident." He took another step forward. "This is a pattern." He gestured toward the patrol cars, toward the officers who had stood by and let this happen. "This is a system where people like me, black men, black professionals, black citizens, face prejudice every day." His voice was unwavering now, where bias is a weapon, not a shield. The crowd was silent, listening, feeling every word. Gaines felt it too. A heavy weight settled in his chest, because the truth was standing in front of him, undeniable, and Malcolm Bennett had just forced him to confront it. Gaines turned to Dawson. His disappointment was evident. "Dawson," he said firmly. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her jaw was tight, her face pale. "Did you even check the vehicle's registration?" A pause. Then, Finally, Dawson shook her head. Her voice was barely audible. I was going to, Captain, but you didn't. Gaines's voice was like cold steel, and for that you will be held accountable. Dawson didn't argue. She knew there was nothing left to say. Malcolm took another step forward, his voice cutting through the still night. Captain, I don't care for empty apologies or vague promises. His voice rose slightly, filled with quiet authority. I want to know, right now, how this system will change. Not just for me, but for every person who looks like me. Gaines hesitated. He felt the crowd's eyes boring into him. He felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. And he knew Malcolm wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for all the voices that had been ignored for far too long, a long silence. Then, finally, Gaines nodded. I give you my word, he said, his voice deliberate and steady. Every necessary action will be taken. He turned toward Dawson, his expression hardened. Officer Dawson will be held accountable for her actions tonight. His voice grew heavier, and I will ensure that no one else has to endure what you did. Malcolm said nothing. His sharp gaze remained unrelenting. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. I'll hold you to that. His voice was ice cold. But remember this, Captain. His eyes locked onto Gaines. Your promises will be judged by your actions, not by the hollow words I've heard far too many times. The moment hung heavy in the air, and for the first time that night, it wasn't just Malcolm Bennett who was on trial. It was the entire system. Despite everything, Malcolm Bennett stood unshaken. His presence alone demanded accountability, forced the truth into the open, and Captain Robert Gaines could no longer ignore it. But when he finally spoke, his voice was cold, detached. Mr. Bennett, I trust that my officers are simply carrying out their duties. If nothing illegal has occurred, then I suggest you comply. Malcolm's jaw tightened, a fire igniting in his eyes. Captain, do you even hear yourself? His voice, though controlled, radiated fury. You're defending an abuse of authority in front of an entire community. A murmur rippled through the gathered neighbors. Then, a voice rang out. Captain, we have evidence. It was Jordan, raising his phone higher so that the live stream captured everything. People are watching, he said firmly, and they won't stay silent. Gaines hesitated, his gaze flickering between the growing crowd, the cameras, and the expectant faces of his own officers. The weight of the moment settled heavily on his shoulders. Finally, his voice softened. I will personally investigate and ensure everything is clarified, he said, the first hint of unease creeping into his words. But Malcolm knew what that tone meant. It meant Gaines was looking for a way out, a way to protect the system, not to fix it. And the community knew it too. To them, his hesitation wasn't caution, it was complicity. Malcolm remained motionless, his piercing gaze never leaving Gaines. Nearby, Dawson and Lawson stood like silent figures in a larger battle, bystanders to a confrontation far bigger than any one of them. But Dawson's face betrayed her. Her rigid stance, her clenched jaw, everything about her screamed inner turmoil. Malcolm turned back to Gaines, his voice low, commanding. A private apology won't fix this. The words landed like a hammer strike. This isn't just about your officers. His voice rose slightly. This is about the institution you represent, about the system that allowed this to happen. Gaines stiffened. Malcolm took a step closer. This isn't an isolated incident, Captain. His voice was cold now, each word sharp as a blade. This is a pattern. Gaines opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm didn't give him the chance. I've seen too many cases buried under the excuse of internal procedures. His voice cut through the night. No, that's not enough. He took another step forward. I want transparency. His gaze burned into Gaines. I want you to publicly acknowledge your team's mistakes, right here in front of this community. His voice grew stronger. And I want a clear plan for change, a plan that ensures this never happens again. The crowd stirred, the tension reaching a breaking point. Gaines hesitated, because now he wasn't just facing Malcolm, he was facing an entire neighborhood. And their patience was gone. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Gaines spoke. Mr. Bennett, he said slowly, carefully choosing his words. I understand what you're asking. He exhaled, but bringing this into the public eye could damage the department's trust with the community. Malcolm let out a bitter laugh, the sound dripping with disbelief. Trust? He shook his head. Captain, do you honestly believe this community still trusts you? He gestured to the crowd, to the faces filled with doubt, frustration, and exhaustion, to a system that, tonight, treated a judge as a suspect, for nothing more than the color of his skin. Gaines had no response. Malcolm's voice lowered, but the power behind it only grew. Trust doesn't come from hiding mistakes. He let the words settle before delivering the final blow. It comes from confronting them and correcting them openly. Gaines fell silent. For the first time that night, a flicker of helplessness crossed his face. He turned to Dawson. She was frozen, her face blank, but her eyes betrayed everything. She hadn't spoken a word, but Malcolm could see the truth written all over her. Malcolm turned to her now, his gaze as sharp as ever. "Do you have anything to say, Officer Dawson?" His voice cut through the silence. The crowd waited, her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time that evening, she felt completely exposed. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't meant for things to spiral like this. But what excuse could she possibly give? She knew. Nothing she said could undo what she had done. She stood there, trapped. Gaines's words, Malcolm's penetrating glare, the flashing lights of dozens of phone cameras capturing her silence. She could feel it, the storm, the judgment, the reckoning. Inside, an internal battle raged. She knew she had been wrong, but how could she admit it? To bow her head before Malcolm, before the community, it felt like more than an apology. It felt like the collapse of everything she believed about herself. Her pride, her career, her place in the world. And yet, as she looked at Malcolm Bennett, she saw nothing in his expression except the truth. And she had no escape from it. Rachel Dawson's lips parted slightly, but she saw nothing in Malcolm's expression except restrained fury. Not uncontrolled rage, not blind anger. A justified fire she couldn't deny. Her throat was dry. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to find her voice. "Captain," she finally said, her words trembling, lacking the cold authority they once carried. I think we need to clarify everything, before the community." She hesitated. "It's our responsibility." Captain Robert Gaines could feel the tension in the air thickening. The crowd, the flashing cameras, the unforgiving silence pressing in on him. He knew the situation was no longer about a single traffic stop. This was a moment of reckoning. He exhaled slowly, then spoke with a tone of compromise, hoping to ease the fire in Malcolm's gaze. "Judge Bennett," Gaines said carefully, "you're right." He straightened his posture. "We will hold a public press conference to acknowledge our mistakes. I also commit to implementing training and reforms to ensure this doesn't happen again." Malcolm nodded slowly, but his gaze, it remained steely, unshaken. "I'll be watching your actions, Captain." His voice was low, firm, an unmistakable warning. "And let me remind you, if I see even a hint of a lack of transparency." The air grew heavier. "I will bring this entire story to the media." A pause. Then Malcolm delivered the final blow. "I have nothing to lose." His voice was sharp as a knife. "But you do." The words hung between them like a final verdict. Gaines gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He knew this confrontation wasn't over. Not tonight, not for a long time. And he knew Malcolm wouldn't rest until real, tangible change took place. Dawson, standing in quiet shame, faced a reality she could no longer escape. Her actions hadn't just humiliated a man, they had tarnished her own reputation. They had shaken the very foundation she thought she was upholding. And now, she had to live with it. In the days that followed, the events of that night spread like wildfire. Footage of Judge Malcolm Bennett, a respected figure, standing in handcuffs while a community demanded justice, went viral. Social media exploded. Comments, shares, and outrage flooded every platform. Hashtags surged. #Justice for Malcolm, end racial bias. What had begun as one night in Crestwood Park turned into a national conversation. The truth was out, and there was no silencing it. But Malcolm Bennett didn't let the moment fade. He seized it. He turned it into action. A week later, Malcolm stood on stage at the local cultural center. The hall was packed. Not just with neighbors, but with journalists, activists, and people who had been moved by his story. Some sat, others stood along the walls. All eyes were on him. Malcolm scanned the room. He could feel their energy, their anger, their hope, their hunger for change. Then he spoke. "Thank you all for being here today." His voice was deep, steady, commanding, yet warm. "What happened to me that night wasn't just a personal mistake." His gaze swept across the room. It was a reflection of something far bigger. A pause. A reflection of how we still treat each other, based on prejudice and false assumptions. He told them about the humiliation he endured that night, the way he had felt invisible in the very system he had sworn to uphold. But he didn't stop at recounting the past. He demanded action. We can't change the past, he said, but we can shape the future. And then, his voice rose, clear and unwavering. That starts with acknowledging our mistakes and committing, fully, relentlessly, to correcting them. At the back of the hall, Rachel Dawson sat, her head slightly bowed. She had almost not come, but she knew she had to face this. When Malcolm finished speaking, he surprised everyone. He turned toward the back of the room, and he called her forward. Every head turned, every eye locked onto her. The weight of their judgment was suffocating. Dawson stood. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked to the stage, and for the first time in days, she didn't run from the truth. She faced it. She faced Malcolm, and she faced the people she had wronged. Her voice was quieter than his, but steady. I know that an apology isn't enough, she began. She hesitated. Then she turned to Malcolm, looking him directly in the eye. But I'm going to say it anyway. I'm sorry. The room was silent. She looked out at the crowd. I made assumptions that night. I let bias cloud my judgment, and I understand now how much damage that does. She took a breath. But words aren't enough. Starting tomorrow, I am committing to undergoing training on implicit bias. And not just that, I will work with this community. I will create regular dialogues between law enforcement and residents, because this isn't just about me making amends. Her voice grew stronger. It's about building something better. The room remained silent. Skepticism still lingered. But some heads nodded, because even if trust was broken, it could still be rebuilt. Dawson exhaled. Then she turned back to Malcolm. Thank you, she said, for holding me accountable. The meeting ended. But the story? It didn't die. Footage of Malcolm in handcuffs, of Dawson standing before the community, admitting her failures, spread across the nation. The pressure on the police department mounted. Public officials were forced to respond. And Malcolm Bennett, he kept pushing. Because this wasn't just his fight. This was a battle for every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin before the content of their character. As the night fell over Crestwood Park, the echoes of the meeting lingered. A spark had been lit. And Malcolm knew. This wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. One that wouldn't be ignored. Rachel Dawson's voice grew steadier as she spoke, her initial hesitation giving way to conviction. That night, she admitted, I didn't just hurt Judge Bennett. She exhaled slowly, then met Malcolm's gaze. I undermined the very values I thought I stood for. Justice. Fairness. A pause. I can't change what happened, she continued, but I can commit to learning from it. She turned slightly, addressing the entire room. I want to do more than change myself, she said. Her voice, once so rigid and cold, now carried something different. A weight of responsibility. I want to help build a fairer system. Her gaze returned to Malcolm, an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent thank you, for forcing her to face her flaws. She took a step back, her shoulders squared, not in defiance but in acceptance. Malcolm said nothing. But the way he studied her, measured, understanding but unrelenting, it was clear. This was only the first step. The room remained silent, not with judgment, but with reflection. Because everyone knew this wasn't just about one night, it was about something much larger. Dawson's words, though unable to undo the past, carried sincerity. And sincerity, when followed by action, had the power to change everything. She pledged to attend training programs to work toward repairing not only her mistakes but also systemic issues within the department. But words were just the beginning. The real test would come next. Would she follow through? Would the system allow real change? Or would this become just another story people moved on from? The meeting ended, but the story, it refused to fade. The video of Malcolm Bennett in handcuffs, standing under the flashing lights of police cars, his face calm but unyielding, was no longer just footage. It was a movement. It spread, not just across social media, but across news networks, opinion pieces, political debates. Justice for Malcolm trended. End racial bias surged. We see you echoed across platforms. Outrage turned into pressure. The police department had no choice but to respond. A public press conference was held. Captain Gaines stood before cameras, acknowledging failures in procedure. Dawson, despite her commitment to change, continued to face scrutiny. But Malcolm? Malcolm didn't let the moment be just about him. In interviews, he didn't just tell his story. He spoke about all the stories just like his. Change, he said, doesn't come from apologies. It comes from action, from transparency, from a system that actually holds itself accountable. His words resonated. More than ever before, the conversation wasn't just about one case. It was about all the unseen cases, all the nameless faces who had been wrongfully accused, humiliated, or worse, without a camera there to capture it. In one widely shared video, Raymond, a longtime neighbor, spoke to a reporter. "This isn't just Malcolm's story," he said. His voice was strong, unshaken. "It's the story of all of us. The story of a system that still isn't fair, that still judges people before seeing them for who they really are." He lifted his chin. "We, the residents of Crestwood Park, won't stay silent." His words sparked something. People across the country from different backgrounds, different experiences, joined the movement. The outrage didn't fade, and neither did the demand for change. As night fell, peace settled over the neighborhood. But the echoes of what had begun in Crestwood Park continued to ripple outward. A spark had been ignited, and Malcolm knew it wouldn't die. Not if he had anything to do with it. This was a fight he had been preparing for his entire life, not just for himself, but for every person who had been, was being, and would be, judged before being seen, denied before being heard, silenced before being understood. He straightened his shoulders, and with a steadfast stride, he walked into the night. Not as a victim, not even just as a judge, but as a symbol of something much greater, an unyielding force in the fight for justice. Malcolm Bennett's story is not just a personal experience. It is a reflection of the realities that many face every day. Injustice, prejudice, a system still in need of change. How do you feel about the way Malcolm confronted this challenge? If you were in his shoes, what would you have done? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to show your support, share it to spread this powerful message, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and meaningful stories. Thank you for joining us.